Welcome, everyone, to tonight's In the Company of Stewards. For those of you who are new to LDS Earth Stewardship, LDS Earth Stewardship is a nonprofit organization that strives to honor the Creator by living and testifying of gospel principles of Earth stewardship. Through educational forums and service opportunities, we hope to help every Latter-day Saint be a steward of the earth. We are very excited to have with us tonight Dania Ellingson. And let me just pull up her introduction. Dania lives in Provo, Utah with her husband, 2 young sons, dog, rabbit, several chickens, and a few thousand bees. She enjoys implementing as much backyard homesteading as she can on her suburban neighborhood property. She loves getting sucked into a good book or TV show, calls all the characters her best friends, and cries whenever they come to an end. We are very grateful that she is with us tonight and excited to hear about her project, and we'll turn the time over to her.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So let me get my screen or my slides pulled up here and we'll get started. I am glad to be here with you guys. And thank you for that introduction. Just, I guess, a little bit more background. So I have a bachelor's degree in experience design and a master's degree in Luso-Brazilian literatures, neither of which are even remotely related or give me any kind of technical or scientific credentials for what I'm doing. Here in the top picture is the day that I defended my thesis from my master's degree. So it's just about a month before I had my second. And it's a bit of a wild time, but what these degrees do offer me is insight into story and insight into experience and how those things inform the way that we navigate the world and motivate us to do different things. So before I go into more about the project, I want to talk about this concept that I've been calling imaginative connection, and what that means and how that applies to us spiritually. So in my bio, you heard that I really love a good story. I love a good character set and really kind of finding the humanity in these fictional characters. It often kind of sounds silly, but it often turns into a spiritual experience for me. And I think the reason for that is because what is engaging with scripture, if not coming to love the characters and not coming to love them to the degree that you long for a tangible connection with them, right? Even in the scriptures, we encounter these people that we don't have like a tangible physical interaction with, and yet we can connect with them. And the same could be said with our relationship with God. And I think it requires a certain level of imagination to be able to facilitate this connection. And this imagination and this drive to connect through our imagination is something that I think is really valuable in Earth stewardship as well. So I want to unpack the word imagination a little bit. I don't know about you guys, but for me, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of imagination is children. And we often associate children with imagination. We talk about how they play make-believe. And I think we often kind of associate that as something that we're supposed to grow out of, that imagination is somehow childish. But I want to talk also about the phrase make-believe, which is kind of synonymous, right, with imagination, and what is faith if not the creation of beliefs. And I want to explore this verse a little bit in this context. I know it's a very common one, but I think it's kind of different when you think about it in this context. Matthew 18:3 says, "Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, he shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. So I just want to make the argument that I think that imagination is an essential component of our faith, and the capacity to think beyond what's directly in front of us, and to use that imagination to understand, perhaps to put ourselves in the position of another, or to imagine kind of an outcome of something that we don't really know. But to be able to have this kind of compassion and this connection is an essential component of our faith. And it's an essential component of our ability to connect with the earth, because we can't have direct conversations with the earth, right? But we know from our imaginative connection how impactful our relationship and our experiences with the earth can be. When, let's see, I think it would have been January of 2013, a professor from another university named Michael Wesch came to BYU to give a forum speech that was entitled "The End of Wonder in the Age of Whatever." And I'm not exaggerating the slightest when I say that it completely rocked my world and changed my life. It's been almost a decade since that address, and I've probably thought about it weekly in all of those years. He talks about another trait that we often associate with childhood, which is that of wonder, and the societal factors that are at play that kind of drive us to lose touch with our sense of wonder. And it's absolutely fascinating the way that he pulls it all together. But he makes the observation that in nearly every language on earth, a question is marked by a raise in intonation at the end of the sentence. And then he ties that into the fact that across the animal kingdom, a raised intonation is an invitation for connection. So think like a growling dog versus one that's whining for attention. And he kind of goes on to explain that questions are invitations for connection across humanity, if not in our physical space, at least an invitation for connection as we share in the give and take of a search for answers. But then he also talked about the kind of questions that his students had started to ask in recent years, and he observed that they were trending less towards an eagerness to learn and more towards wanting to know what was expected of them, like is this going to be on the test kind of a question. So he kind of explained questions have this, at least the potential to invite connection, but it does matter what kind of questions we're asking. Are they he talked a lot about, are they questions that take us on a quest? And I want to frame, excuse me, I want to frame this conversation to consider what kind of questions we're asking in our pursuit of Earth stewardship. Are we asking questions that will foster connection? Are we asking questions that will take us on a quest? Are we asking questions that will drive us to make believe a little bit and to facilitate and to create a sense of faith and connection in that way? It was interesting. I think perhaps the reason that this particular address hit me so hard was because that very same week, we had this freezing rain in Provo, which I know there are parts of the world where this is very common, but for Provo, it's very out of the norm. And I had woken up early, had an 8 a.m. class. And normally during that, I had a 20-minute walk to class. And normally I would walk and just, kind of head down thinking about my classes. I didn't really make any contact with anybody. But on that day, I was trying to make it 20 minutes uphill on one citywide sheet of ice. And what it turned into was one long chain of students clinging to each other, trying to not fall and slide back down to our apartments. And it was the sense of wonder, that something that was out of the ordinary, that pulled us out of ourselves and pulled us into the moment, that drove this connection. And there truly is a lot of power in learning how to identify those things. And I just want to show you here. Oops. I have a, so here's a clip of that day.
Glad someone's got cameras out. Yeah, seriously.
I was coming from the other end of campus, but I mean, people were sliding down this hill, and it was just, you can see the smiles on everybody's faces, and
oh man,
and people talking to each other, and in a second they're going to tell them to watch out because this guy's about to bowl them over, and and it's, you know, it was a really simple simple in the sense that none of the individual people did anything different, but somehow the sense of wonder evoked connection. And I think the sense of wonder is something that's can be part of our faith. We really have a doctrine of connection that's kind of scattered throughout our beliefs in LDS theology. I think perhaps it's most obvious in our doctrine about family history work. And this quote here from Elder Cook, he says, "We need to be connected to both our roots and our branches." And of course, here he's talking about family trees, but I also believe that it's important that we be connected to the roots and the branches in our earth, in the trees, in the bushes, and the plants all around us. And my personal belief is that the spirit of Elijah, which we often talk about as the thing that drives us and calls us to family history work to connect with our ancestors, I also believe that the spirit of Elijah is what's fostering the spiritual stirrings that we feel in the need to awaken to our responsibility as earth stewards. This verse in Malachi 4:6 says, "He shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." So we see that there's some kind of a connection, right, between the connection between the fathers and the children and their fathers, and somehow the earth is a part of that. And we'll talk about this. You'll kind of see more of what I mean throughout the presentation, but I think that our ability to imaginatively connect with our ancestors, with God, with the people around us, and with the earth are they're all essential components of our faith. So just a background on the project that I'm wanting to work on. This is my very first year on it, and so I'm admittedly still forging the path. But the kind of summary of the project is that I noticed that kind of all across town, I was seeing rotting produce on the lawns underneath trees, and it broke my heart. It felt like such a waste, and and I want to do something to address that. So it's important to me that that the project benefit the residents as well as myself and people that we have engaged in this project. So my plan is simply to just purchase the produce from the residents in the hopes that I'll be able to get enough produce to collectively merit something like a farmer's market booth where I can then sell the produce, whereas you wouldn't really want a whole booth for just like one apple tree's worth of apples. And so my plan is to be able to collect them, and by pooling them together, be able to more effectively distribute the produce to people that are wanting to consume it. So I have the question, how can I incentivize people to put to good use the produce that's otherwise going to waste? That's kind of a driving question, the project. But another one that wasn't quite as apparent to me at the beginning, but I've kind of stumbled on, is the question of how do scarcity and abundance inform each other? And I asked that question because I've lived in Provo since I was 9 years old. With the exception of my mission, it's been almost 2 decades worth of living here. And, I ran cross country in high school. I was very frequently making it across all of the streets across town. I had plenty of opportunities to encounter rotting fruit on the ground. And it just never really stood out to me until this last season. And as I wondered why that was, I think perhaps part of it was kind of the sense of scarcity that was sent to all of us in the midst of COVID. But I think also part of it was in the last 2 years, essentially since I graduated from my master's program, I've really felt this longing to live and work on a farm. And that's a whole story in and of itself. It's a little bit of it's a little far away for us right now. Still, my husband is still going to school. But feeling that longing to be a part of the creation of food and not having access to really be a part of it in any kind of a scalable, substantial way. It felt like a sense of scarcity to me, not because we didn't have food, but because of a sense of scarcity in my involvement. But it awakened me to the abundance that was everywhere else. And in that abundance, the waste that was happening. And I think that there's more to unpack in this question, how scarcity and abundance inform each other. And I'm just going to leave you with that question. I don't know that I really have like a full answer for it, but I think it's worth mulling over. Another question that I have spent a lot of time thinking about was one posed by Sharon Eubank, first in the 2019 Fall Forum here with LDS Earth Stewardship, and then revisited again in the 2020 with the panel. But the first question that she asked was, when we waste what others desperately need, what are the ramifications to our physical hearts and our unity? And again, I don't know that I have a complete answer on this, but I will say that I think that waste is both a cause and an effect of a lack of imaginative connection. And I say both a cause and effect because connection spirals in whatever direction you send it. So if you foster connection, it will spiral upward towards more and more connection. If you foster disconnection, the opposite will be true. And I'll illustrate that a bit in this next story here. When I first started talking online about the Rescued Foods Project, a woman messaged me in appreciation of the project and told me about how she had grown up in poverty. And she has very clear memories of walking past homes with rotting fruit on the lawn and aching to be able to eat it. And the heartbreak that caused her to not have access to that perfectly good food that her family couldn't afford to purchase. And so I guess my answer to this question here is that when we waste what others need, is that we drive a divide between those who have and those who have not, whether that's intentional or not. That ends up being impact. And I think that imaginative connection is one way that we can combat this, because often I imagine in this circumstance, as this little girl was walking to school every day past homes that have rotting fruit that she wanted to eat, I imagine that it was not malicious, right? It was most likely the homeowners had moved in. Perhaps the fruit tree was there before they even got there. They weren't even really interested in having the fruit tree. They didn't want to be a part of the upkeep, or maybe it was just a busy year and something was happening in their personal lives. But whatever it was, something was happening where there was a lack of imagination on who would need this fruit and how we can get it to them. So I want to kind of take this same circumstance, but flip it and imagine what would happen if we consider Sister Eubank's question in the reverse. So not when we waste, but when we put to good use the things that we have. What does that do to our physical hearts, and what does that do to our unity? And so let's imagine, instead of this little girl walking to school every day past this fruit that she wanted to eat but couldn't, what if the residents had simply put up a sign that said, take as much as you want? And what if one of the days that she was going to pick up some fruit, the homeowner came out, was on their way somewhere, and they had an exchange of thank yous and your welcomes, and they smiled, and they both left a little bit happier for having made that connection? Doesn't doesn't that sound like Zion? To me, that sounds like Zion. And so I think that as we work to reduce waste, not only reduce waste, but also put it to good use, I think that we get to be a part of helping everything on this earth fulfill the measure of its creation. The dropped apricots have a purpose, and we can be a part of it fulfilling that purpose by being wise stewards of this earth. And as we facilitate the fulfillment of the measure of creation of everything on this earth, we get to be a part of facilitating Zion as well. So with that preface, I want to take a little bit of time to just reflect on kind of an exercise of imaginative creation. So I want to take this exercise and just kind of imagine the story of the life of the producing life of one fruit tree. So let's say it's an apple tree. We'll estimate 50 years of production time, depending on the tree and the care and a variety of other factors. That could either be a really generous or like a gross underestimation of its production lifespan, but let's situate ourselves in the middle of it. So the tree was planted more or less around the turn of the century, and it will continue to produce well until more or less the year 2050. And consider, we're doing this because, again, my background is in literature and experience, but I think that it's a really powerful exercise to learn to lean in and imagine and facilitate that connection. So consider the people that were involved. Who was it that planted the tree? Who lived in the home over the course of those years? If it's in the front yard, perhaps, who are the people that walk by on a regular basis? And think about these people. What are their interests? What are their concerns, burdens, hopes, dreams, triumphs, or failures? And also take into consideration major local or global events, or major events that happen within the family that lives there, or families that live there. This is an exercise of storytelling and of imagination. So there's no right or wrong. But I want you to take this exercise just wherever your heart takes you and kind of watch through the eyes of the tree. And we'll come back in about 5 minutes and share where that takes you. Okay, so let's come back together here. And if you'd like to share any of what came up with for you, either in the chat or if you would like to share with your voice here, that would be great as well. But I'd love to hear what you came up with for the story of this tree, and we can kind of write the story together.
I really love this exercise. Yeah, I did part of it sort of envisioning, but part of it sort of capturing pieces of stories that I know of trees, of fruit trees. But I was thinking about a tree that was part of a family, like a kind of middle family with kids spanning both high school to entering school. And so seeing a lot of transition. And the point of the tree being planted was to sort of educate those kids with work ethic, but also to be delicious. And so the kids were involved in the caretaking, but also then got to be a part of sort of the gift giving away of what the trees produced, and seeing and experiencing sort of abundance. And then, the trees cared for, but also predominantly just in the background. There's a few exceptions maybe when it's in the center stage, for good or for bad, when there's concern about what's going on with the weather or something like that, or maybe when it's lit up by decorations, or it's in full bloom, but not usually the center stage, but steady and an example of seasons of loss and resilience, and there always being sort of another year. And the family felt like it was like the family and the tree sort of getting used to each other, more understanding about how to interact better as just time passes, and then being able to see neighbors come and go, and some neighbors never going, but also, neighborhood change with foot traffic and real traffic, and the types of houses and stores that surround them. So a lot of change, but very steady feeling.
That's beautiful. I love that so much. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I love the idea of kind of walking it through the different ages of the kids and it coming in and out of center stage in that way. It's really beautiful. Was there anybody else that wanted to share speaking?
It brought up many memories for me. This is Michael, Elizabeth's husband. I have a lot of memories of fruit trees throughout the different parts of my life. And it's been interesting to see how a single tree, because it's stationary and families often come and go many times in its life, it ends up experiencing a lot of short stories as it has different caretakers. Or it goes through periods where it has no one to take care of it. And then you might even have someone who comes after it's been neglected and cares for it again. They even have the story of the family that comes when the tree has become nothing but an old stump. And it marks a time in that land's history that the neighbors who grew up there might remember how verdant and how beautiful the area around it was when it was cared for.
It's beautiful. I love that idea too of kind of families that come and go, perhaps a tree on like a rental property even, and how many different lives that tree would see as people come in and out. But I love this exercise of just stopping to kind of see, I don't know, maybe there's a better word than the one that comes to mind, but seeing the humanity in all living things. And I don't like the word humanity because I want to appreciate their being and that perhaps the spirits, seeing the spirits of everything, and the potential, and looking through their eyes helps us to understand what the measure of their creation is and how we can be a part of helping them to fulfill it. About a month ago, maybe, I attended a pruning workshop at a property held just about half an hour away from my home. And it was just on an older gentleman's property. A professional pruner was coming there, and he was just kind of using all the trees on the property as an example. And he had a variety of different trees. There were several peaches and a pear and plum. Anyway, so we're just kind of going through learning how to prune the trees. And somewhere in the course of the class and the conversation, the older gentleman whose property it was pointed out this very old apple tree. And he spoke about it with a sense of reverence and deep love and admiration, and said that his grandfather had planted that tree in the 1920s. And now, a century later, that tree continues to produce so many apples that his family can't consume them all. And so I just want to briefly take this exercise and expand it. So we dealt with a 50-year span, but this tree came to life in the Great Depression, and then it grew through World War II, the founding of McDonald's, the Civil Rights Movement, the first moon landing, the dawn of the internet, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, massive hurricanes and earthquakes, and a global pandemic. And it fed families who lived through all of those moments in history too. And the tree is healthy and will continue to do so for many years to come. But I wanted to do this exercise because it's an exercise of imaginative connection, which is to say that it's an act of faith. And as we work to to see the spirits and the life and the fullness of existence in something as simple as a tree. It facilitates a depth of connection that perhaps we had never imagined. I certainly, as I thought about this tree and kind of researched, just looked up major historical events since 1920, and I felt such a profound love for this tree that I had never even eaten an apple from this tree, but just having been in the presence of this tree, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the tree that had been providing for people through all of this. And I think, I think that by developing this sense of imaginative connection, we create Zion hearts that are knit together in love, and in unity and in support for one another, both within humanity and beyond it, to all of God's creations. And I just want us to consider, can we facilitate the earth's fulfillment of the measure of its creation? And can the earth facilitate the fulfillment of the measure of ours? Can we perhaps seek Zion not only within humanity, but seek Zion through all of God's creations? Because I think that's what Zion really is. So with that kind of preface and background on my journey and exploration of this project, I kind of want to zoom way out and just look at the big picture. I apologize to those of you who are not based in the United States. I could only zoom so far. I had to keep it kind of where my head could wrap around it. So we'll just work with the US in terms of getting a bigger picture. And I invite everyone, myself included, to get an even bigger picture after the meeting sometime on your own time. But I want to talk a little bit about US landfills and the system and how that works, because this was kind of a turning point for me as well. So the United States Environmental Protection Agency estimates that more food reaches landfills and incinerators than any other single material in our everyday trash, which is astounding, not only because it's problematic because it takes up space in the landfill, or it is converted into greenhouse gases in the incinerator, but it's also concerning because there are people who are hungry. And so not only are we taking up space, but we're also wasting something that someone desperately needs, which, as we've talked about earlier in response to Sister Eubank's question, that it divides us. So they estimate about 63 million tons of wasted food in 2018 alone. Only 32% of that was managed through animal feed, composting, donation, etc. I'm now realizing that I put a dollar sign instead. Those are supposed to both be percent signs. But food waste constitutes 24% of landfills and 22% of what's combusted. So nearly a quarter of our waste that's going into landfills or to incinerators is food. And until I started researching this, I wasn't fully aware of what happens. I guess I kind of assumed, I knew that I should be reducing my waste, and I figured that whatever food I put in my trash was not a big deal because it would all just decompose. But it turns out that's not the case. So this is perhaps a more extreme example, but an anthropologist in the United States started a project called the Garbage Project, where they started kind of digging around in landfills to try and learn about people in recent history. So they opened up this landfill. This is a picture of carrots, and they're 10 years old, and they still resemble carrots. They're still shaped like carrots. They're just black on the outside, but on the inside, they're still bright orange. So a lot of the just the circumstances and the conditions of landfills are not conducive to decomposition. So just to bust that myth, that food that goes into the trash doesn't decompose, it doesn't go away. It just stays there almost preserved, but wasted. So a step above this in terms of progress would be to compost it, right? We can take this food and we can compost it, and then the nutrients are recycled. It can be used to feed plants and to fertilize a new generation of food. Then it doesn't take up all this space in the landfill or go to an incinerator. But it does ignore entirely the question of the people who need the food. Food insecurity is a concern, and there are people here in the United States that operate on a spectrum of food insecurity, but according to the United States Department of Agriculture, 10.5% of all U.S. households experienced food insecurity at some point during 2019, and that number increased to 23% in 2020, which is nearly 1 in 4 homes. Interestingly, this isn't like a direct comparison, but I do think it's interesting that a quarter of our waste is food, and nearly a quarter of homes last year needed more food. But looking into the households experiencing food insecurity further, so 6% of the full population of the United States, 19 million Americans live in what's called a food desert, which there's kind of a spectrum of definitions, but essentially a food desert is just a place where the people who live there have a hard time accessing foods. They don't have grocery stores nearby, or the grocery stores that are nearby are extraordinarily expensive, or they only really sell things like convenience foods and they don't really sell produce. So there's 19 million Americans living in a place where they don't have access to the food that they need. And we're throwing away, 63 million tons of food every year. And a lot of this can kind of be boiled down to a distribution problem, which is the supply chain is a massive project to take on. It's not one that I'm taking on directly. But it's something to be aware of, and it's something that was highlighted in the midst of the pandemic as well, as supply chains were interrupted. We saw farmers dumping gallons upon gallons of milk down the drain because the schools were closed, and so now they no longer had anybody to purchase the milk, but the cows still had to be milked, so they would milk the cows and dump the milk. So it's a distribution issue, right? The same issue, just on a larger scale, as of what we're trying to address with rescued foods. And the larger scale is very overwhelming to me. I imagine it's very overwhelming to a lot of people. I would like to eventually get to a point where I can address it on a larger scale, but I do think that there's a lot of value in seeking out local solutions to food distribution problems. Because it feels more approachable, but a local food distribution system also has its benefits outside of lowering the overwhelm. We have less gas emissions from trucking the food all over the place. We get to support local economies. We can foster and build communities, and it's also more resilient to problems like COVID because there aren't so many steps in between where only you take one link out and suddenly the whole thing is broken. So a couple of things that are happening that I think are really beautiful, and I just wanted to highlight that are being done specifically to address the issues of food deserts are things like food co-ops. So one person is kind of the facilitator, where they're kind of responsible for bringing all of the food into the community in their home, and then the members of the community can come and pick up the food from their homes. So we see this with food co-ops. There are people doing mobile food markets, which is like the grocery store version of an ice cream man. They kind of drive around with produce and visit different neighborhoods that otherwise wouldn't have access to good food. The one pictured here I especially like just because it reminds me of my mission in Brazil, the bus stop farmers markets. People are waiting at the bus stop anyway, and they need food. And often the people that are frequenting these bus stops are the very people that are struggling to get to grocery stores because they don't have access to personal transportation, right? So finding ways to bring the food to the people is one way to address the problem within our communities. So I just wanted to highlight those few ideas in hopes of maybe sparking some imagination for what you guys can do in your own communities as well. Because I believe in connection between people. I believe in connection to the earth. I believe that food can bring about a lot of connection as well, as we gather around a meal or have a potluck where everybody pitched in a little bit. I think there's something about feeding the food, feeding the soul, feeding connections that's really powerful and worth exploring as well. So with that, I just want to end with my testimony. I testify of the power of connection. I testify of the power of creative thinking and imagination and making believe, seeking faith in a way that can create as God creates, which is taking existing matter to things that are separate and being the link to create something beautiful and profound. As God took matter unorganized and organized it together into this beautiful earth, I think we have an opportunity to do that as well on a smaller scale, to take matter unorganized and an unorganized food distribution system within our small spheres of influence, and to be the link to create something beautiful and profound and something that reaches across generations. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. I feel inspired and moved. Thank you so much, Dania. We are so grateful for your presentation tonight.